"This is Evelyn," my son said into the microphone with a polite smile on his face, the relative staying with us temporarily. A few people laughed softly, thinking it was some harmless joke, but I felt my fingers tighten around the tray of vanilla cupcakes I'd spent all morning decorating with pink frosting roses for my granddaughter Lily's 8th birthday party. I stood there beside the folding table in Michael's backyard while the late afternoon sun slipped behind the cedar fence, and for one strange second, I felt like a guest at my own family's life. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones sitting closest to us at the table." The backyard looked beautiful. I'll give Samantha that much. White paper lanterns hung from the patio cover, pink streamers fluttered in the breeze, and a rented bounce house filled half the lawn while neighborhood children ran through the grass screaming with sugar-fueled excitement. The smell of grilled burgers drifted through the air, mixing with sunscreen and freshly cut grass. From a distance, it looked like the kind of family gathering people post online with captions about gratitude and blessings. But standing there with that cupcake tray in my hands, I realized something painful. I no longer belonged in the picture they were creating. Michael kept smiling as he introduced other guests. "That's Samantha's sister and her husband. Those are our neighbors from across the street. And over there is Lily's piano teacher." Not once did he call me his mother. Just the relative staying with us temporarily. As if I were some distant cousin who needed a place to sleep for a few weeks instead of the woman who gave birth to him 32 hours after labor nearly killed me. Samantha avoided my eyes as she passed around lemonade in clear plastic cups. She wore a pale blue sundress and the calm expression she always used when she wanted to appear generous in front of other people. "Can you put the cupcakes over there?" she asked quietly, pointing toward the far end of the dessert table beside the melting ice cream cake. "Not think. You. Not Mom. Just instructions." Lily ran past me wearing sparkly sneakers and butterfly wings tied to her back. "Grandma, look what Daddy rented for me," she shouted before disappearing toward the bounce house again. At least one person still called me Grandma. I held on to that tiny comfort harder than I should have. Then I noticed something else. The framed family photo sitting beside the birthday gifts showed Michael, Samantha, and Lily standing together on a beach in matching white outfits. I wasn't in it. And suddenly, standing there beneath those paper lanterns while strangers smiled politely at me, I realized my son hadn't introduced me that way by accident. I stayed until the last child left the party. That was what mothers like me did. We stayed to wipe down folding tables, gather paper plates from the grass, and scrape half-eaten slices of birthday cake into the trash, while everyone else drifted back into the house laughing about television shows and vacation plans. The sky had already turned gray by the time I began pulling streamers off the fence one careful piece at a time. My knees ached from standing all day, but I kept moving anyway because slowing down would have meant thinking too much. Through the kitchen window, I could see Samantha loading gifts onto the counter while Michael opened another bottle of sparkling water for their guests. Nobody asked if I needed help carrying the decorations into the garage. Nobody even noticed I was still outside. A cold breeze rolled through the backyard, lifting the corners of the pink tablecloths. I folded them slowly, smoothing each wrinkle with the palm of my hand the way I used to smooth Michael's hair before school when he was little. Back then, he used to cling to my arm every morning and ask if I would still be waiting when he came home. I always was. That memory hit me so suddenly that I had to stop moving for a second. The garage door opened behind me with a mechanical hum. Michael stepped out holding a black trash bag. "You do not have to clean everything up, Evelyn," he said casually, tying the bag closed. "Evelyn. Not Mom." He said my name now the same way someone speaks to a neighbor they barely. "No, I do not mind," I answered quietly. He nodded distractedly and glanced back toward the house where Samantha was laughing at something one of her friends said. "By the way," he added, "next weekend we may have a realtor stopping by for a quick walkthrough. Samantha wants advice on property values in the neighborhood." My hands froze around a stack of paper plates. "Property values?" I repeated. "Just curiosity," he said quickly. "You know how she is. Always watching the market." Then he disappeared back inside before I could ask another question. I stood there in the darkening garage staring at the shelves lined with old boxes from my life. Christmas ornaments from the 1990s. Frank's fishing gear still untouched 3 years after his funeral. Photo albums with fading labels written in my own handwriting. Suddenly the words temporary relative echoed in my mind again, but this time they sounded less like a joke and more like preparation. When I finally went inside, the kitchen was spotless except for one thing. Sitting beside the sink was the framed beach photograph from the gift table. I picked it up carefully and turned it over. The date on the back was written in Samantha's neat handwriting. Maui. Family trip. 2 years ago. That was the same month I had stayed home recovering from pneumonia while they told me the vacation had been canceled because money was tight. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise the way I always did. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the rain tapping softly against the kitchen windows. Seattle rain had a way of making everything feel smaller somehow. Smaller rooms. Smaller conversations. Smaller lives. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around myself and stood at the stove making coffee while the rest of the house slept. For years, mornings had belonged to me. Frank used to sit at the kitchen island reading the newspaper while I cooked scrambled eggs and buttered toast. Michael would stumble downstairs half awake in his socks asking where his baseball uniform was. Back then, this house sounded alive. Now it sounded careful. Controlled. Like everyone was trying not to disturb someone else. I carried my coffee into the family room and noticed another framed photograph sitting on the bookshelf beside the television. Samantha must have rearranged things again after the party. It was a newer picture this time, taken during Christmas. Michael and Samantha stood beside the fireplace smiling while Lily sat between them in matching pajamas. Even their golden retriever wore a red bow around its neck. I stared at the picture for several long seconds before realizing something unsettling. I had taken that photo myself. My fingers were steady enough to frame their perfect little family, but somehow there had never been one with me in it afterward. I slowly looked around the room. More photographs lined the walls. Disney World. Pumpkin patches. Beach weekends. School recitals. In every single frame, I was either missing completely or standing off to the side like someone who had wandered into the background by accident. The realization settled into my chest quietly, which somehow hurt more than if it had arrived like anger. Samantha came downstairs around 7 wearing cream-colored workout clothes and carrying her phone in one hand. "Good morning," she said distractedly before opening the refrigerator. "Morning," I answered. She pulled out almond milk and berries without looking at me. "By the way, if anyone asks, the realtor is just helping us understand renovation potential. Michael worries too much." I looked up from my coffee cup. Why would anyone ask? For the first time that morning, she hesitated. Only for a second. "People get curious," she said lightly. "Especially neighbors." Then she smiled, that polished smile she used whenever she wanted to smooth over something unpleasant. "You know how people talk." I nodded slowly, but something about the way she said it stayed with me all day. Around noon, I stepped outside to collect the mail. Mrs. Collins from next door was trimming roses along her fence line in gardening gloves and a wide straw hat. She waved when she saw me. "Evelyn, dear," she called warmly, "I meant to tell you how lovely the birthday party looked yesterday." "Thank you," I said politely. She gave me an odd look, then lowered her pruning shears. "I was surprised when Samantha mentioned you might be transitioning soon." My stomach tightened. Transitioning? Mrs. Collins frowned slightly, as though realizing she had said something she should not have. Oh, perhaps I misunderstood. But the way she suddenly avoided my eyes told me she had understood perfectly. That afternoon, I could not stop thinking about the word transitioning. Mrs. Collins had said it gently, almost kindly, but underneath her careful tone was the unmistakable sound of pity. I had heard that tone before. People used it when discussing someone who had lost independence. Someone whose life was quietly being packed away room by room while everyone pretended it was for their own good. I spent the rest of the day moving through the house like a stranger studying someone else's life. The upstairs hallway smelled faintly of Samantha's vanilla candles now instead of the lemon polish I used for years. The framed watercolor paintings Frank loved had disappeared from the walls, replaced by minimalist prints in white frames. Even the kitchen looked different. The ceramic cookie jar Lily used to sneak treats from after school was gone. In its place sat a sleek espresso machine that hissed loudly every morning like a warning signal. Little by little, my home had been edited until almost nothing of me remained. Around 4 o'clock, I opened the hallway closet looking for an old blanket and noticed something odd. The plastic storage bins containing Frank's winter coats and photo albums had been moved from the upper shelves down to the garage boxes marked donation. I stared at the labels for a long moment. Samantha's handwriting. Clean. Precise. Donation. I knelt slowly and opened one of the bins. Inside was Frank's navy wool coat folded beside the fishing hat Lily used to wear while following him around the lake during summer vacations. The sight of it hit me so hard, I had to sit down right there on the hallway floor. Frank had loved this house more than anyone. We bought it 36 years ago when Michael was still in elementary school. Back then, the backyard was mostly dirt and weeds. Frank spent entire weekends building flower beds with his own hands while Michael chased the sprinkler in little red rain boots. One day this place will be full of grandchildren, he used to say. And for a while, he had been right. I closed my eyes and suddenly remembered something else. About a year before he passed away, Frank had been sitting beside me on the back porch after dinner watching Samantha through the kitchen window. She was talking to Michael in that soft, controlled voice she used whenever she wanted something. Frank stayed quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Do not let anyone make you feel unnecessary in your own home, Evie." At the time, I laughed it off. I thought grief and age had simply made him overprotective. But now, sitting on the hallway floor with donation boxes surrounding me, his words no longer sounded protective. They sounded prepared. That evening, Samantha came upstairs carrying folded towels. She stopped when she saw the open storage bins. "Oh," she said lightly, "I was just trying to organize things." Some of these old items were collecting dust. Old items. I looked down at Frank's coat resting in my lap. Then I looked back at her perfectly calm face and realized something chilling. She had already begun sorting through my memories as though my absence was only a matter of time. 2 days later, rain covered the neighborhood in a gray mist that blurred the pine trees and rooftops outside the kitchen windows. Michael had already left for work, and Samantha was upstairs on a video call speaking in the overly cheerful voice she reserved for clients and strangers. I sat alone at the dining table sorting through old receipts and birthday cards mostly because I needed something to do with my hands. The house felt tense now, like a room holding its breath before bad news arrives. Around 10 o'clock, the front doorbell rang. I opened it to find Mrs. Collins standing there holding a glass pie dish covered with foil. "Blueberry," she announced softly. "Too much sugar for Harold these days." Harold had passed away 6 years ago, but she still spoke about him in the present tense sometimes. I stepped aside to let her in, and she glanced around carefully. Before lowering her voice, "Is Samantha home?" "Upstairs working," I answered. Mrs. Collins nodded slowly and placed the pie dish on the counter. "Good." Something in her tone made my stomach tighten again. She turned toward me fully then, removing her gardening gloves one finger at a time. "Evelyn, I need to ask you something, and I hope you will not take offense." "All right." She hesitated before speaking. "Did you recently decide to move into assisted living?" The words landed so quietly that for a second they almost did not feel real. I stared at her without answering. Mrs. Collins continued carefully. "Samantha mentioned it during book club last month. She said the transition had been emotional for the family, but necessary because you were having difficulty managing stairs and finances alone." I felt the blood drain slowly from my face. "I never said any of that," I whispered. Mrs. Collins sighed sadly as if she had already suspected the truth. "I thought it seemed strange. You still drive yourself to church every Sunday. You walk 2 miles every morning. You certainly look more capable than half the women in my bridge club." I tried to laugh, but the sound caught in my throat. Difficulty managing finances. The irony of it almost made me dizzy. 3 years ago, after Frank passed away, I had used nearly $200,000 from my retirement savings to help Michael and Samantha avoid foreclosure when his business partnership collapsed during the pandemic. I paid off their overdue mortgage quietly because Michael cried at my kitchen table and promised it was temporary. He promised they would all take care of each other from then on. Now strangers believed I was the dependent one. Mrs. Collins touched my hand gently. "There is something else," she admitted. "Last week I overheard Samantha speaking with a realtor outside. She said once everything was finalized, the property would finally feel like theirs. Mine." The word echoed painfully inside my chest. Not ours. Not family home. Theirs. Upstairs, I heard Samantha laughing through the office door while rain tapped steadily against the windows. I looked around the kitchen. Frank and I built together. 36 years ago, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it felt like to be erased while still alive. That night, I barely slept. Rain slid down the bedroom windows in thin silver lines while the digital clock beside my bed crept slowly past midnight. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the same phrases repeating in my mind. Temporary relative. Transitioning. Finally feel like theirs. The words did not sound emotional anymore. They sounded organized. Planned. Around 2 in the morning, I got out of bed and walked quietly downstairs in my robe. The hardwood floors creaked softly beneath my feet as I crossed the dark hallway toward Frank's old study. Samantha called it the reading room now, but Frank had spent 20 years in there balancing checkbooks, organizing fishing licenses, and pretending to work while secretly watching baseball highlights with the sound off. I turned on the desk lamp, and the warm yellow light filled the room. Dust floated slowly through the air. For a long moment, I simply sat there staring at the framed photograph of Frank beside the computer monitor. His smile looked calm and certain, the way it always did whenever life became difficult. "Do not let anyone make you feel unnecessary in your own home." I could hear his voice so clearly now that it almost hurt. I opened the lower filing cabinet drawer where we kept important documents. Insurance policies. Tax returns. Mortgage paperwork. Most of it was exactly where I remembered leaving it. But one folder near the back caught my attention immediately because I did not recognize the handwriting on the label. Estate planning. I pulled it out slowly. Inside were printed documents neatly clipped together. Durable power of attorney forms. Medical authorization paperwork. Assisted living brochures from places outside Seattle. My hands began trembling as I turned the pages. Some sections already had my name typed into them. Emergency contact, Michael Harper. Secondary contact, Samantha Harper. Recommended transition timeline within 6 months. 6 months. I stared at the number while my heartbeat thudded heavily in my chest. There were notes attached with yellow sticky tabs in. Samantha's handwriting. Discuss with Evelyn after holidays. Emphasize safety concerns. Mention social opportunities. The language sounded cheerful and caring, but underneath every sentence was the same cold message. Remove her carefully. I sat frozen in Frank's chair while the house remained silent around me. Then another detail caught my eye. At the bottom of one page was the logo of a local law office. Brooks and Turner Estate Services. My stomach tightened again because I recognized the name instantly. Daniel Brooks had been Frank's attorney for nearly 15 years. Why would Samantha have his paperwork? Before I could think further, footsteps moved across the upstairs hallway overhead. I quickly slid the papers back into the folder just as Samantha's voice drifted faintly down the stairs. "Michael," she called sleepily. "Are you downstairs?" I turned off the desk lamp immediately and sat motionless in the dark study while my pulse hammered in my ears. Upstairs, silence returned after a few moments. But sitting there in darkness with that folder resting on my lap, I realized something that changed everything. They were not simply waiting for me to leave. They were already building the story that would justify making me disappear. The following morning, I waited until Michael and Samantha left the house before I touched the folder again. Samantha had yoga on Thursdays, and Michael usually drove into downtown Seattle early for meetings, so by 9:30 the house finally belonged to silence again. I sat at the kitchen island with the paperwork spread neatly in front of me while cold coffee sat untouched beside my elbow. Outside, rainwater dripped steadily from the gutters, and somewhere down the street a lawnmower hummed faintly through the damp air. Everything looked painfully ordinary, which somehow made the documents feel even more disturbing. I read every page carefully this time. suggested memory evaluations, senior transition planning, financial oversight recommendations. There were even handwritten notes about converting the downstairs guest room into caregiver space once I relocated. Relocated. Such a polite word for removing someone from their own life. I kept staring at Samantha's handwriting, trying to understand when exactly my future had become a project she could organize inside color-coded folders. Then I noticed something else attached near the back. A printed estimate for renovations. Kitchen expansion. Master suite redesign. Backyard landscaping. Estimated property value after upgrades, $2.3 million. My hands slowly lowered onto the counter. Frank and I bought this house for $180,000 in 1987. We skipped vacations for years to afford extra mortgage payments. I worked double shifts at the hospital during the recession while Frank repaired neighbors' boats on weekends for extra cash. Every inch of this house existed because we built it together piece by piece. And now Michael and Samantha were planning renovations before I was even gone. A strange calm settled over me then. Not sadness. Not anger. Something colder. I reached for my phone and stared at Daniel Brooks's number saved in my contacts. Frank used to joke that Daniel charged by the breath because his office was so expensive, but he trusted him completely. My finger hovered over the screen for several seconds before I finally pressed call. Brooks and Turner Estate Services, a cheerful receptionist answered. This is Evelyn Harper. I would like to schedule a meeting with Daniel Brooks privately if possible. There was a short pause. Of course, Mrs. Harper. Mr. Brooks knows your file very well. Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten again. We arranged an appointment for Monday morning. After I hung up, I quietly returned every document exactly where I found it. Same folder. Same drawer. Same angle beneath the insurance papers. By lunchtime, Samantha returned carrying shopping bags from an upscale home store downtown. Decorative pillows. New candles. A large framed sign reading "Gather Together" in white cursive letters. Do you like this one? She asked brightly while holding it against the dining room wall. I looked at the sign for a moment. Gather together. The irony almost made me smile. It is lovely, I answered softly. Samantha beamed with satisfaction and continued decorating while music played from her phone. I watched her moving through the house with complete confidence, rearranging furniture and replacing old pieces as though ownership had already transferred quietly into her hands. Then Lily came running downstairs holding a coloring book. Mommy says when Grandma moves to her new place, I can finally have the pink bedroom upstairs. Samantha froze for half a second. Just half a second. But it was enough. After Lily ran back upstairs with her coloring book, the house became very quiet. Samantha stood beside the dining table, still holding the decorative sign against her chest, while sunlight filtered weakly through the rain clouds outside. For the first time in years, I watched uncertainty cross her face. Small. Fast. Gone almost immediately. Children misunderstand things sometimes, she said lightly as she placed the sign on the buffet table. I folded my hands carefully in my lap. Of course, I answered. Samantha smiled again, but it looked tighter now. Lily gets excited about redecorating. She has been asking for that room forever. I see. That was all I said. Not because I had nothing else to say, but because I was beginning to understand something important. Silence unsettled people far more than arguments ever did. Samantha kept glancing toward me while pretending to straighten throw pillows and candle holders. She wanted reassurance. She wanted me to remain soft and unaware. Instead, I simply watched her quietly until she finally excused herself upstairs. That evening, Michael came home carrying takeout bags from an expensive seafood restaurant downtown. Thought we could have a nice family dinner tonight, he announced with forced cheerfulness. Lily clapped excitedly while Samantha poured sparkling water into glasses. I noticed Michael watching me carefully throughout the meal as though checking whether I seemed upset or suspicious. Mom, he said suddenly while unwrapping chopsticks, Samantha mentioned you seem tired lately. Have you been sleeping all right? The question sounded casual, but underneath it was something measured. Observant. I set my fork down gently. I sleep fine. Good. He replied quickly. We just worry about you sometimes. Worry. Another polite word. Samantha reached over and squeezed his hand supportively. The performance would have looked loving to anyone else. Halfway through dinner, Lily looked up from her noodles. Daddy, are we still making Grandma's room into my ballet room after she leaves? The table went completely silent. Michael's face lost color instantly while Samantha inhaled sharply beside him. Lily blinked in confusion, unaware she had shattered something carefully hidden. Sweetheart, Samantha said too quickly, we talked about not interrupting adults during dinner. But you said after Grandma moves to the happy apartments near the water, Lily continued innocently. You said there is a pool and movie nights there. Michael stared down at his plate. He would not look at me. Not even then. I felt strangely calm as I reached for my water glass. That sounds lovely, I said softly. Samantha finally forced a nervous laugh. We were only discussing possibilities in the future. Nothing decided. Possibilities. Future. More careful words. I nodded as though I believed her. Then I stood slowly from the table and carried my untouched dinner into the kitchen sink. Behind me, conversation struggled awkwardly back to life, while rain tapped steadily against the windows again. I rinsed soy sauce from my plate beneath warm water and stared out into the dark backyard where Frank once built Lily a wooden swing set by hand. Somewhere upstairs, music drifted faintly from Samantha's office. In the dining room, Michael laughed too loudly at something Lily said. But standing there at the sink with water running over my hands, I finally understood the truth completely. They had already imagined a future without me in it. The only problem was that nobody had bothered asking whether I intended to disappear quietly. Monday morning arrived cold and silver beneath low Seattle clouds. I left the house just after 8 while Samantha was upstairs drying her hair and Michael stood in the kitchen scrolling through emails on his phone. Doctor appointment, he asked without looking up. Something like that, I answered calmly. He nodded absently and reached for his coffee. 30 years ago, that same boy used to wait by the front door so I could button his winter coat before school. Now he could barely lift his eyes long enough to wonder where I was going. Daniel Brooks's office overlooked Elliott Bay from the 21st floor of a downtown building lined with glass and steel. Frank always hated coming there because parking cost too much, but he trusted Daniel completely. The receptionist greeted me warmly and led me into a quiet conference room with dark wood walls and floor-to-ceiling windows streaked with rain. Daniel entered a few moments later carrying a leather folder beneath his arm. He looked older than I remembered, his hair almost entirely silver now, but his expression softened immediately when he saw me. Evelyn, he said gently. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. Something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I sat slowly across from him. You know why I am here? Daniel sighed and opened the folder carefully. Frank asked me to prepare for this possibility years ago. For a moment, I could not speak. Outside the window, ferries moved slowly through gray water while rain blurred the skyline beyond them. What possibility? I finally whispered. Daniel folded his hands together. Frank loved Michael deeply, but privately he worried about how easily your son could be influenced when emotions and finances became involved. Especially after Samantha entered the picture. Hearing someone else say her name aloud inside that quiet office felt strangely final. Daniel slid several documents toward me across the polished table. The house was placed into an irrevocable trust after Frank's diagnosis. Sole beneficiary during your lifetime. You. Michael does not own the property. Neither does Samantha. I stared down at the paperwork while my pulse pounded softly in my ears. Then why do they act as though everything already belongs to them? Daniel's expression darkened slightly. Because they likely assumed the estate structure was simpler than it is. Frank specifically instructed me not to discuss the trust unless you requested information yourself. My throat tightened painfully. Even after death, Frank had still been trying to protect me. Daniel continued carefully. There is something else you should know. About 6 months ago, Samantha contacted my office asking questions about transferring authority if your cognitive health declined. I felt suddenly cold despite the warmth of the room. Did Michael know? Daniel hesitated. That hesitation answered everything. I looked down at my wedding ring resting against the conference table and remembered the night Frank slipped it onto my finger in a tiny church outside Tacoma 40 years ago. We had almost nothing back then except faith in each other. Daniel's voice softened again. Evelyn, nobody can force you out of that house. Legally, they have no authority over your property, your finances, or your medical decisions unless you choose otherwise. Choose otherwise. Such simple words. But as I sat there listening to rain strike the windows high above Seattle, I realized something painful. Michael and Samantha had already built their entire future around the assumption that eventually I would surrender quietly. The only thing they had never prepared for was me saying no. When I returned home that afternoon, the house smelled like rosemary chicken and lemon cleaner. Samantha was cooking dinner while soft jazz played through the kitchen speakers, creating the kind of atmosphere people mistake for peace. Michael sat at the island reviewing spreadsheets on his laptop, his sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. For one strange moment, everything looked normal again. That was the danger of families like ours. The cruelty never arrived screaming. It arrived hidden beneath polite smiles, home-cooked meals, and concern disguised as kindness. "How was your appointment?" Samantha asked without turning from the stove. "Productive," I answered calmly as I hung my coat beside the door. Michael glanced up briefly. "Everything okay?" "Everything is very clear now." The words slipped out before I could soften them. Michael's fingers paused against the keyboard for half a second. Samantha slowly stirred the sauce in silence. Nobody asked what I meant. During dinner, Lily chatted happily about a school project involving Washington state history while Samantha nodded at all the right moments. Michael laughed when he was supposed to laugh. Across the table, I watched them carefully and realized something unsettling. They truly believed they were good people. That was what made everything feel so cold. Around halfway through the meal, Samantha folded her napkin neatly onto her lap and gave Michael a small glance. The kind married people exchange when they have already rehearsed a conversation privately. "Evelyn," she began gently, "there is something we have been meaning to discuss with you." I set my fork down quietly. "All right." Michael cleared his throat. "We have just been thinking long-term. About what is best for everyone." There it was again. Everyone. Never once had they simply said what is best for you. Samantha leaned forward slightly, her voice calm and measured like a nurse speaking to a nervous patient. "You have been through so much these past few years, and we know maintaining such a large property can become overwhelming eventually." I listened without interrupting. Outside the dining room windows, rain slid slowly down the glass while headlights moved through the dark street beyond the trees. "There are wonderful communities now," Samantha continued carefully. "Places with social activities, fitness classes, waterfront views. People your own age." My own age. As though aging itself had quietly removed me from the center of my own family. Michael finally looked directly at me then. "We just want stability, Mom." Stability. Another carefully chosen word. I looked at my son for a very long moment before speaking. "That is interesting," I said softly. "Because I spent 36 years believing this house already was stability." Silence settled heavily across the table. Lily looked nervously between us while Samantha's expression tightened almost invisibly. Michael lowered his eyes first. Not me. Him. That was when I understood something else. Deep down, he knew exactly what they were doing. He simply lacked the courage to stop it. Samantha recovered quickly and forced a small smile. "Nobody is trying to upset you." I nodded slowly and reached for my water glass. "No," I replied quietly. "You are trying to manage me." The room became completely still after that. Even the music from the kitchen speakers seemed suddenly too soft. Michael stared down at his untouched dinner while Samantha sat frozen with her wine glass halfway to her lips. And for the first time since Frank died, I watched both of them realize something they had not expected. I was no longer confused. The atmosphere inside the house changed after that dinner. Not dramatically. Families like ours never exploded all at once. Instead, tension settled quietly into the spaces between conversations. Samantha became overly pleasant, speaking to me with exaggerated patience as though rehearsing kindness for an invisible audience. Michael stayed later at work and avoided lingering in the same room with me too long. Even Lily sensed something shifting beneath the surface. 3 days later, I asked everyone to be home by 6 o'clock because I wanted a family dinner together. Samantha looked surprised when I made the request. Special occasion, she asked carefully. Something like that, I replied. I spent the afternoon cooking Frank's favorite meal. Pot roast with carrots, mashed potatoes with too much butter, fresh rolls warming in the oven. The smell filled the house slowly, wrapping itself around old memories buried beneath years of tension. For a few hours, the kitchen almost felt like mine again. At 6 sharp, everyone gathered around the dining table. Rain tapped softly against the windows while candles flickered beside the centerpiece Samantha bought last spring. Michael loosened his tie and looked exhausted. Samantha wore a cream sweater and pearl earrings, polished as always. Lily colored quietly beside her plate while waiting for dessert. I served dinner calmly, the same way I had thousands of times before. Nobody spoke much during the meal. Forks scraped gently against china. Ice clinked softly in water glasses. Finally, after dessert plates were cleared away, I folded my napkin carefully beside my coffee cup and looked directly at Michael. I met with Daniel Brooks on Monday. The effect was immediate. Samantha's hand froze around her wine glass. Michael slowly lifted his eyes toward me. Neither of them spoke. He explained the trust arrangements Frank created before he died. I continued softly. Samantha recovered first. Evelyn, I think there may be some misunderstanding about what we discussed the other night. No, I said calmly. I understand perfectly now. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, nobody is trying to take anything from you. I looked at my son for a long moment. He looked older suddenly. Tired. Cornered by choices he should have made years ago. Then why did your daughter already know I was leaving? Silence answered me. I reached into the folder beside my chair and placed several documents gently onto the table between us. Legal copies. Trust paperwork. Property ownership records. Samantha stared at them as though the pages themselves had insulted her. The house belongs entirely to me during my lifetime, I said quietly. No transfer can happen without my consent. Samantha's face lost color almost imperceptibly. Michael picked up one of the papers with trembling fingers. Mom, no, I interrupted softly. You introduced me as a temporary relative in my own home. You allowed neighbors to believe I was mentally declining. You planned renovations before I was even gone. My voice never rose. It did not need to. Samantha finally leaned forward, desperation slipping through her calm expression for the first time. We were only trying to prepare for the future. I nodded slowly. So was Frank. The room became completely still after that. Even Lily stopped coloring. Then I reached for my coffee cup and delivered the final truth as calmly as discussing whether. I have decided to sell the house. Michael looked up sharply while Samantha stared at me in open shock. The buyers take possession in 60 days, I continued. Which means you will both need to make other living arrangements. The next 60 days passed quietly, which somehow made everything feel heavier. Samantha stopped pretending after the dinner conversation. She moved through the house with tight smiles and clipped answers, speaking to me only when necessary. Michael became restless. Pacing through rooms late at night while searching online for houses they could no longer afford in neighborhoods they once assumed they would inherit naturally. Sometimes I heard them arguing softly behind their bedroom door after Lily had gone to sleep. Not screaming. Just the exhausted sound of two people realizing their plans had collapsed. Meanwhile, I began packing my own things slowly and carefully. Not because I had to leave, but because for the first time in years, I was choosing where my life would go next. Daniel helped me purchase a small cottage near the Washington coast overlooking gray water and rocky beaches lined with driftwood. The house was modest compared to the one Frank and I built together, but it had large windows, a stone fireplace, and a kitchen filled with morning light. Most importantly, every corner of it would belong entirely to peace. On my final morning in the Seattle house, rain fell softly over the backyard where Lily's old swing set still stood beneath the cedar trees. Movers carried out the last of my boxes while Samantha stood near the staircase pretending to scroll through her phone. Michael lingered silently by the front door with both hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. He looked like a man standing inside the ruins of a future he thought was guaranteed. Before leaving, I walked slowly through each room one last time. The dining room where Frank proposed repainting the walls every spring but never did. The kitchen where Michael learned to make pancakes standing on a chair beside me at 6 years old. The hallway where Lily took her first steps while Frank cried harder than anyone else in the room. Houses remember things even after families stop honoring them. At the front door, Lily suddenly ran toward me holding something folded in both hands. "Grandma, wait." I knelt carefully despite the ache in my knees. She pressed a crumpled drawing into my palm. It showed 2 little houses beside the ocean with stick figures standing outside holding cupcakes. "So you do not get lonely," she whispered. My throat tightened painfully for the first time in weeks. I kissed the top of her head gently. "I could never be lonely after being your grandmother." Behind her, Samantha looked away quietly while Michael stared down at the floorboards, unable to meet my eyes. In the end, he never apologized. Perhaps some people mistake silence for dignity because admitting the truth feels too heavy to carry. I stepped outside into the cold morning air and paused beside the moving truck one final time. The cedar tree swayed softly in the rain while the house stood behind me exactly as it had for decades. But something inside it had changed long before I decided to sell it. A home stops being a home the moment love becomes conditional. As the driver closed the truck doors, I slipped Lily's drawing carefully into my purse and looked once more at the family standing on the porch. Then I smiled politely, climbed into my car, and drove toward the ocean. Strange thing about people. They only start calling you family again after they realize you were never temporary at all.